I prefer a situation in this country where people were more able to choose their own risks in their life and less able to impose, as it were, risks on others or to liberate others from risks. And there's one example of this, by the way, if I can very quickly throw in, it hasn't come up yet, but as a journalist, I should mention this, a self-hating journalist. I mean,
sure, we can get you help.
The bit that nobody's thrown in here, which I think has to be thrown, is the role of the press in all of this. Because I think that there is a serious problem with the press in this country, and indeed in most democratic societies at the moment. This comes back to the role that was intimated earlier about where government gets its pressure from. Journalism in this country now has become is a very unnatural thing in nature. It doesn't have any predators. And this is a real problem for our democracy. Government, when it is seen to have, rightly or wrongly, whipped up a fear of risk, is generally punished for it, and crucially can be punished for it at the ballot box. But the papers, which I think are more responsible than anything in this country for whipping up fear, and often knowingly so, knowingly telling untruths on occasions, has no predator on this, has no punishment for it. Nobody can do anything to rein it in, and politicians won't do it because they fear the backlash from the media itself.
David,
and this is destroying our politics.
I suspect you might agree with that one.
I do. I thought that was very beautifully put. The predators I liked. Let's pick this tragic case of this mother and child. I think that there was some learning difficulties in the family, who were picked on mercilessly by a bunch of youths, and then very sadly took their lives as a consequence of what was happening to them. And there's been some criticism of the police and their ability to protect them. The fundamental question there is the young people involved in that kind of merciless bullying. It's the young people's values, their culture, and how that is affected. Now, there's a role for government, schools, youth services, social services, but there's also a role for all the other things that we've taken for granted. The role of the church, philosophical and cultural elements coming into that community, the role of consumerism and pop culture and how that affects those young people. The bottom line is, if the community say, you could have protected that family if you put CCTV in, and you looked at that house and that road and that estate the whole time, then someone's got to be monitoring that CCTV. If they don't monitor that CCTV, then perhaps they'll be taken to court when there's litigation. The technology is not the solution, and sometimes I think government can fall into the trap of believing that that's the solution. The real solution comes back to very human solutions, which is how we treat one another, and that's the much harder ingredient in which government cannot, no political party can have all the answers, and that's the central challenge, it seems to me, in Britain as we face it, and it's the one the media push to one side most often and don't want to address. It's why I think so many people get upset at the dumbing down of the BBC that used to be able culturally to explore some of these issues in different ways, and now you see them pushed aside and everything is about Pop Idol, X Factor or Fame Academy or whatever it is.
Dylan, just before we go to the audience, you mentioned earlier the question of the banking crisis and the financial crisis. I mean, isn't there a case that there was insufficient fear on the bankers' part? It was clearly awful risk assessment, and although you also blame the borrowers, would you really put the balance of responsibility that way around, equally divided?
I don't know how I would apportion the responsibility, but I agree there were obviously terrible mistakes made by people in the financial services industries. Most of the people were risk stupid. But I think this ties not so much to the lack of fear, but links into something David was just saying about the tendency to over-rely on technology, because what we saw in the 1990s was this massive sort of shift in the way risk was regulated in Wall Street and the banks, from people who were making judgments about risk to the over-reliance on complex mathematical models And I think what happened as a result of that was that Wall Street and our equivalent financial centres hemorrhaged risk intelligence, and people came to. And now we still haven't learned from that. So now, for example, instead of when in the flash crash the other year, when suddenly everything broke down, the solution to that is now, well, we'll have automatic circuit breakers to stop these things sort of triggering off. But the point is, no, we need to get back to a time where people can, use these models, but let's also temper them with some sort of reasoned ability to figure out as well, deal and think more in a sort of more sophisticated ways about risk ourselves.